Let's speak more then about what happened at the Munich Security Conference. Bring into the conversation Dr Kingsley Makhubela, former South African ambassador to Portugal, also seasoned international relations expert. Let's welcome you to SABC News. As always, Dr Makhubela, good to have your time. So one of the lines that have caught the attention of the world media is from the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, speaking about how the United States and Europe are from one civilization, the Western civilization. What does that mean today? And ultimately, what is its value with the current global or world order?
Good evening, Tamil. You know, the speech by Marco Rubio has sent a chilling message across the world. The thesis of his speech, essentially, it's rebuilding the Western civilization and seeing the Western civilization as the only force globally. He doesn't recognize the fact that the world has changed and has evolved so much. That's one. Of course, he also repudiates international law. He sees international law as extraterritoriality, not the US behavior. That's one challenge. Of course, his attack on theocracy in Iran, but not addressing the same trends of theocracy that we're seeing emerging, for instance, in Israel, where the far right has taken over literally everything. So, and of course, attacking forces that fought against colonialism as non-believers and so on. So the statement by Rubio reasserted this thing. And of course, Temegile, this thing of building a new century for Western civilization, it has sent a very scary message to all of us.
And Rubio then went on to talk about how basically the US and Europe should not be shackled by guilt. He said in one of the remarks that basically the United States is not going to be a polite caretaker of the West's managed decline. As far as that is concerned, how much of a glimpse does it give us into the approach that the Trump administration is going to take in advancing its agenda in the many corners of the world?
Of course, he's looking at the economic decline in Western Europe, and you could see the undertone of that message was directed at China. China, cheap labor, that's what he's saying. But you know, he's not acknowledging one fact that even the CEO of Apple has acknowledged that China has produced more engineers. China has evolved from what it used to be 10, 15 years ago. And there's no holding of China. There's a need to really find a way of working with China. You know, Temegile, I saw a clip by the former head of the MI6, Richard Moore, who also acknowledged that, you know, holding China would be impossible. So the Western world needs to find a way of coexisting with China. But what Marco Rubio was talking about, it's this repudiation of interdependency. I mean, he just hosted a meeting last week in Washington to deal with some strategic minerals that they really need. But these minerals, these critical minerals, are not only coming from the United States, they're coming from all over the world. I mean, they are buying about 80% of their platinum comes from South Africa. So there's some level of interdependency which Marco Rubio is not acknowledging, and he sees that as a threat to the national security. But you know, the Chinese train has moved, Tembegile. There's no way of stopping China. There's a need to find a way of coexisting with China. You can see the queue of leaders who are going to Beijing, and it will be followed by Donald Trump. He's going there in April. He's used to summon people at the White House, but this time around, he's the one who's going to Beijing. So there's a recognition in terms of the power of the Chinese and this emerging multipolar world that I think is causing some level of resistance. Temegile, let's not forget, Marco Rubio is a new con. He's trying to really reincarnate the agenda for America. And that agenda for America, it was based on serious violence. Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich, they were the drivers of this agenda for America that really was advocating for toppling of what they call the axis of evil. You may have heard even in his speech, he speaks about the evil of communism. They try to invoke some level of biblical law at the expense of international law. So that's what we're starting to see, and that's what's causing serious concern. There are many civilizations that have contributed to what the world it is today, and there's a need to acknowledge the coexistence of all these civilizations.
So what does the message, the posture from Rubio then mean for countries that are, for all intents and purposes, less powerful than China and sit on the opposite side of this Western civilization as imagined by the United States? Countries like South Africa, for instance, that have already found themselves in the crosshairs of the White House.
You know, Temegile, is this argument that you are with us or with them? In his speech, he spoke about the rivals. These rivals that he's talking about is referring to China and Russia. But the United States is doing a lot of business with China. I mean, as it is, the United States, I think, is doing close to 800 billion of business, of trade with China. And the expectation is that the rest of the world should not interface and interact with China and Russia. And this argument that you are with us or with them is something that has caused serious problems at the height of the neocon when they were in power. But I think they are trying to reincarnate that. And I'm worried that Marco Rubio, he has the ambition to become the president, but with this kind of statement that does not recognize international law. I mean, he sees international law, Tembegile, as encroaching on sovereignty of the Western world. But the Western world is queuing to Beijing.
I wonder if that Western civilization that Marco Rubio references is going to then lead to a more frequent occurrence of what we saw, for example, in Venezuela, when the Americans swooped in the middle of the night and captured the president of a country. How divided the local population is on that is well stated, but ultimately it is another country taking the president of another sovereign state, right? But also, are the Europeans then fully on board with this vision, shall we call it, laid out by Rubio?
You know, one thing that is sending uncertainty to Europeans is this tendency to acquire Greenland by force. That at one stage the United States was quite emphatic about that. And of course, the repudiation of the liberal order that most of the European countries have bought into it. So those are the issues that are causing uncertainty in terms of what is the new agenda that they are advocating for. That's one point. The other issue, Tembegile, it's around the extraterritoriality behavior of the US and total disregard of international law. We've had President Trump saying that he has no regard for international law. He's going to use his intuition. And that was the thesis of Marco Rubio that really causes some level of uncertainty even amongst his allies.
Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, good to have you on the program, as always, former South African ambassador, as well as international relations expert, speaking to us here on The Full View.